So hello, everybody. I would like to say thank you very much for joining us today for the next series, or seminar in our Daniel O. Trainer Wildlife Health Seminar Series. This is hosted by the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. My name is Jennifer Summers. I'm the Program Development Specialist for Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. And this is the fourth seminar in this series. So before we begin, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who helped with planning this seminar series. Of course, first I'd like to give acknowledgements to Dr. Scott Hengstrom, who is the director of the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. Also, Shelley Dubé, one of our wildlife faculty, who is one of our wildlife health faculty experts, and she helped put this together and organize some of our speakers. Dr. Marie Perkins, as well as another one of our wildlife faculty here, and Dr. Ben Settinger as well, who is our waterfowl specialist on campus.
Can you share your screen, Jennifer?
Oh, am I not sharing my screen? Thanks, Scott. Yeah, that would certainly help. Let's try this again. How's that? There we go.
That looks great.
Thank you, Scott. So again, thank you to everybody who helped make this a possibility. And before I move on, just going to cover a little bit of Zoom etiquette here. For those of you that are joining us, we are going to have everybody on mute. You will not be able to unmute yourselves. If you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat, and at the end we will answer questions as long as Dr. Wild is willing to stick around. So please put all your questions in the chat, and we ask that for bandwidth purposes, please keep your videos off. So in the meantime, so this is something that we do every time we have a public gathering at UW-SP. We recognize the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point occupies lands of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land and the sacred land of all Indigenous peoples. Scott?
Yes, it's my honor to be able to welcome all of you to the Daniel O. Trainer Wildlife Health Seminar Series. If you wouldn't mind advancing, we have a long list of great presentations, and we're nearing the end of actually this semester's presentations. But part of the reason why we did that is to acknowledge the legacy of Dr. and Dean Daniel O. Trainer. He was an expert in the field of wildlife.
Sorry, Scott, technical issue there. Can you unmute yourself?
Unmuting.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Well, I'm just going to jump right in where I was. I'm welcoming everyone and acknowledging Dr. Daniel O. Trainer. He was a dean here at the College of Natural Resources, and he was an expert in the field of wildlife health, wildlife diseases. He wrote 2 of our landmark books in wildlife diseases, and he was acknowledged with a Distinguished Service Award from the Wildlife Disease Association back in 1972. But he also saw other opportunities, and he got more involved in people, we'd have to say, in that he became the Dean of the College of Natural Resources in 1971 until 1987. He taught a wildlife diseases course here, and I actually took that course in 1980 from Dr. Trainer, and he really was an exceptional teacher. He had so much experience that he was able to convey in his labs and also in his lectures, and really appreciated him for helping kindle an interest in mine in wildlife diseases that I've been able to continue on through my career. He also worked and served the Wisconsin Natural Resources Board from 1980 to 1986. He's recognized in the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. And for those students of you who walk through our doors every day of the TNR building, that is the Trainer Natural Resources Building. Indeed, the building we work and live in is named after Dr. Trainer. So with this, it's our opportunity to just herald the legacy of Dr. Trainer. Shelley, I'm happy to pass it on to you to introduce our speaker today.
Great, thank you so much, Scott and Jennifer. I really appreciate the nice intro to the seminar series. I'm super excited to have Dr. Wild with us today. We were just discussing before we opened everything up to all the students and members of the public that we ended up going on a trip in Alaska together in 1996, which it doesn't seem possible that it was that long ago. It was at the Wildlife Disease Association conference up in Alaska, and that was the year that Beth Williams and Tom Thorne received their Distinguished Service Awards, and last week Billy Karish was our speaker, and he received that award most recently. So Margaret did her bachelor's, her D.V.M, and her PhD all at Colorado State. She kind of considers her Colorado to be her home. And in 2018, she moved to Washington as a faculty member there, and she's been studying this really interesting syndrome, Elk Hoof syndrome, ever since. But for some of you who are familiar with the chronic wasting disease literature, Dr. Wild became infamous, shall we say, for her article published on selective removal of CWD positive animals by wolves, and saying that maybe we can have a potential solution to the CWD problem by having more wolves on the landscape in that modeling work. So she's prolific in the literature. She's a real force in the wildlife health community. And so we're really excited to have Dr. Wild with us today.
Thanks so much for that nice introduction, Shelley, and Scott for introducing me more to Dr. Trainer. I've always had his book on my shelf, and I never knew that much about him. So I'll just start sharing my screen here. And there we go. And I am really happy to be talking with you guys today. And although it would be really nice to be there and meet in person, I always love going to different campuses and meeting with students. But this does allow us to get together across the miles from Washington to Wisconsin. And so that's great. And I need to start off by saying that I am not an expert in this topic. In fact, I'm not even sure everyone would say I'm good at it. But I really recognize the importance, and I do my best to communicate and to promote collaborative approaches, because that's what it's really going to take to meet our goals to promote wildlife health. And the views that I'm going to present today are my own, and while particularly near the end of the presentation, I'll base some of my statements in scholarship. Many others are just my observations and experiences. And my perspectives have been shaped by a career, or maybe you could say careers, as a wildlife veterinarian and a researcher. As Shelley said, at the state level with the Colorado Division of Wildlife, as well as with the federal government as the chief wildlife veterinarian for the National Park Service for about 20 years. And then most recently as a professor at Washington State University. And I think the breadth of this experience has really helped me understand the bigger picture. And also understand my colleagues in different agencies and kind of their positions and where they're coming from. What I don't have much experience with is working with the tribes. And so you're going to notice that my references will be kind of light in that area in this presentation, not because it's not important, but just because I don't have that much experience there. So I'd like to start off with a little bit of a story. And it didn't happen at this particular public meeting, but one like it that occurred when I was a student working with researchers who turned out to be among my most important mentors. And they were at a public meeting in a rural area talking about elk management and their research. And this was a long time ago, and the meeting room was actually right behind a bar. But my colleague had just finished giving a slide presentation. And a guy in the back of the room stands up and pulls up his pants, and you kind of get the feeling already this might not be going real well. And he said, or shouted really, "I just want you to know that I've got sons and I've got grandsons, and we're gonna fight you till we die." And I think the guy might have had a little too much to drink too. So it was this confrontational situation. But my colleague responded quickly and coolly. And he just said, well, I'm really glad you feel so strongly about how your wildlife are managed, which is something I really care about too. Thanks for coming out tonight. And there's a lot of ways he could have responded, but that just always really stuck with me. And now when I think about it, when I'm on one on the panel or at the microphone on the other side of the table, and when stakeholders ask me questions or confront me, I think about the way my colleague responded so coolly. And I think about how a calm response can diffuse conflict. And the importance of finding common ground. If people come to these public meetings, like us, they care about wildlife for them almost always. And so finding that common ground that we care about wildlife and their health and their welfare is important. But being realistic, we're not going to change people's values quickly with one answer. But what we can start to do is build trust. And that trust is really important. So I try to look at it like this. And my goal is to keep the door open when I answer a confrontational question like that for a continued conversation. And so what I try to do in addition to this is then follow up with people personally. So when I can, I seek those folks out after a meeting and I see if we can have a conversation. And while it's not what my fight or flight instinct tells me to do, I've really built some good trust doing that. Even if at the end of the conversation we agree to disagree. I think people really appreciate it when you will follow up and listen to their viewpoints. And even if you go into it thinking you're not going to learn anything, you can be completely mistaken there too. And you can learn as much as hopefully they learn in those conversations. So today, what I'd like to do is look at 3 areas of potential communication and collaboration that can significantly contribute to promoting wildlife health. And those are interagency communication and collaboration, looking at the relationship between academia and management agencies, and then closing up with the importance of engaging stakeholders. And these are certainly not the only areas of communication and collaboration, but they're the ones I have experience with. And also I think they're transferable to similar situations and ones that you're maybe likely to encounter too. So we'll look at case studies and then talk about some lessons that I learned. And maybe you'll see those same lessons or think of your own lessons or come up with your own approach. And as with many things, once you see the response or the solution, you might think, well, gosh, that seemed really simple. But often, particularly when you're in the thick of these situations, it's really hard to see unless you take a step back and think it through, and better yet, have processes or models to use that can help you work through issues and step out of these difficult places. So overall, the goal today is just to get you thinking about the importance of having skills in collaboration and communication, just like you have skills in other aspects of your profession. So let's start with the interagency interactions. This could be between agencies within a jurisdiction, so say a state Department of Agriculture and a state Department of Wildlife, or between the Federal National Park Service and USDA. Or it could be between jurisdictions like state and federal entities or tribal and federal entities. And each of these entities make their own decisions for their land with their own stakeholder groups. But the impacts of those decisions affect more than just that one agency or jurisdiction. And of course, we know this is particularly true because wildlife don't recognize boundaries. There's so many challenges to wildlife that you'd think we could get along and be a united front to support wildlife health and have similar missions and mandates and ways forward, but that's not the case. And so what we need to do is figure out ways to work together for the benefit of wildlife that also takes into account these individual missions and mandates and gives them the respect they deserve as well. So as an example of this is this played out a lot when I came to the National Park Service from a state wildlife management agency. And my colleagues were constantly asking me, why don't parks do something about wildlife management issues, and particularly disease issues? And of course, this was a time of, kind of the natural regulation phase of the National Park Service and very much a hands-off approach. And so actually, I gave a presentation on this one year at a professional meeting to try to address the question more efficiently than just responding every time my colleagues asked me something. And to do that, I used a couple case examples. And so I pulled those out. And the first one is on bovine brucellosis in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Now, this was 20 years ago. The issue still remains. But 20 years ago, the real crux of the issue was with bison as the primary wildlife species affected. Now we see elk being a big player as well. But at the time, it was really about bison and bison on National Park Service units. And so bovine brucellosis in bison in the GYE was a really significant source of tension between the National Park Service, who managed the bison on the parks, of course, and the USDA, APHIS, and state agriculture agencies who were trying to take the final steps to eradicate brucellosis from the US. And so the USDA wanted to use techniques like test and cull or vaccination that worked in livestock or were used in captive wildlife, even at other national parks, and apply them to these free-ranging animals in Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks. But the NPS was not having this, and saw the bison as the symbol of the Department of the Interior and this great conservation success story. And they weren't really concerned about the disease itself because it wasn't negatively impacting the bison population. And so this is a pretty common situation you can get into with each entity kind of having their own views and then digging their heels in on them. And while it's not earth-shattering, there was this big move forward when in the early 2000s, there was an interagency bison management plan created. And what it did is set forth a couple of objectives. And one was to maintain a wild, free-ranging population of bison. And the second was to address the risk of brucellosis transmission to protect the economic interest and viability of the livestock industry. Now, this is one of these situations where you go, well, that was simple, but it took years to get to the recognition that these were the important points and what each agency really wanted. It wasn't, so USDA wasn't saying not culling, they didn't just want to cull bison or vaccinate bison to vaccinate bison. They wanted to do it to address the risk of the disease transmission. And not resisting culling on the part of the Park Service's place because the disease was only really important to bison. But their concern was it was going to impact that natural free-ranging bison population. And so by simply articulating these important needs to each one of the agency, it then allowed for more creativity in the problem solving and allowed to consider alternatives to meet the needs. And it's still a sticky situation, of course, but such simple declaration of these shared objectives was really an important step. And it really can't be understated how simple something so simple could really be so important and also so challenging to get to. Another situation when I was with the Park Service involved the USDA Wildlife Services request to NPS to be involved in the management or elimination of rabies, terrestrial rabies, using primarily an oral rabies vaccination program. And their goal was to drop these vaccine baits and create a barrier to stop the geographic spread of rabies in species like raccoons and coyotes. And when I joined the National Park Service in 2000, the NPS did not want to participate. And the problem was this left gaps in the barrier that USDA was trying to create. And so that was a real issue. But I tried to find out why wouldn't NPS participate. And it was because they assumed that rabies was not, or was actually, they assumed rabies was a native disease. And so based on the mission of the National Park Service, they are supposed to protect things that are native in the ecosystems. And so they thought it would make sense to protect rabies as a native disease. Well, there's a couple issues with that. And the first is that rabies, of course, is a significant public health risk. And so we have to take that into consideration whenever we're looking at maintaining something natural in an ecosystem. We also need to think about public health. And what was even more perhaps persuading to them was the fact that rabies was not indeed native in these raccoons or in these coyotes. It had been introduced. These terrestrial strains of rabies had been introduced by early European settlers. With this recognition and acknowledgement, it provided an opportunity to look at our own policies and see how we might be then a part of this larger effort to collaborate. No longer were we putting up this wall and saying, no, digging in our heels, no, it's our policy and we can't collaborate because it goes against our mission. But it let us work within our mission and say, you know what, we do want to get control of this disease because it's killing native wildlife species. And vaccination is not outside of our mission. And so the vaccination's okay. But then we looked at some other points of the USDA plan. They had culling included, and they had some rather intensive ways to distribute the bait sometimes. And so what we did is we looked at compromises. Okay, you know, maybe hand distribution of baits in these areas so we don't have impacts on cultural resources. And let's not include culling in the national parks, that we will use vaccination as our route. So what we do is we get success by incorporating the new information that's brought to the decision maker. And then also by not seeing the issue as binary, that is either all or none. And in doing so, we can create a space for compromise and for solutions that then can be true to everyone's mission and mandate, but also benefit wildlife health. So just some lessons that I learned through these situations of the interagency interactions was that communication is really required, and it's made so much easier when you have existing relationships. And I find that often the field folks, the people on the ground, often have better communication and relationships than the folks sitting in Washington, D.C., or the leaders in suits. And so I think we can make some good progress just by respecting each agency's mission and mandate and working together with these other agencies. Generally, we're working toward the same goals. We both agree rabies is not a good thing. Brucellosis is not a good thing. But how we address the management to meet our goal, that is what may differ among agencies. And it also is what allows us to be creative, and that creativity is very important to find solutions that work for each entity. And then I think the other part of this is really being careful to find common messaging and communicate the common goal. And this can really help build the public trust and support. And even if you look around at our world today, for example, with COVID and the impacts when we don't have common messaging and what that can do to confusing the public and how they ought best respond, we see real life situations playing out around us every day. So similarly to these interagency collaborations, but a bit different, is collaboration between academia and management agencies. And just as we said before, each has its own mission and mandates. And with academia, that's primarily creating knowledge and training students, versus a management agency who has the authority for the resource management. Now, assuming we're talking about folks in the wildlife field, theoretically, we should have pretty similar or the same goals of promoting wildlife health. And I think that is the goal, but I often see unintended consequences that confuse stakeholders or maybe make us not as efficient as we could be. And now that I'm in academia, I don't feel so bad about maybe being a little critical of academia. Because in reality, what I've seen is that academics can get, or what academics get grants to do oftentimes is what drives the research as much or more than the research that really needs to be done to benefit a manager. And the academics need to do that because they need the funding and they need the publications to keep their job. But I see collaboration as a way to help meet the goal of getting those grants and those publications, and also benefiting agencies and the resource if we can figure out ways that might benefit both of us when we're moving forward with these projects. So a couple examples how we might do that. The first, Shelley mentioned, I've worked in chronic wasting disease for most of my career. And CWD is a great opportunity for partnering between academia and management agencies because universities have the capacity to bring grants and to conduct basic research that can have, that can be applicable to improving basic knowledge and eventually be applied to informing management. And so, for example, university research can be focused on like the molecular level of the prion protein and be able to develop new diagnostic tests and identify the influence of host genotype on disease susceptibility. And those are things that usually would be beyond the capability of a management agency. And I had great outcomes when I worked for state and federal agencies in teaming with academia, primarily by providing samples they wouldn't otherwise have. And also by explaining to them the larger context to help them see where their research could fit. And then that sometimes would help them in justifying their work to obtain funding by being able to make those arguments that this is really important research to benefit the wildlife resource. And the wildlife resource is really important to humans, as well as having its inherent value. But as much as I saw that opportunity, though, I also saw some missteps. And I think this was particularly the case with reference to the zoonotic potential of CWD. And so this may seem like a bit of a tangent, but to talk just about One Health for a minute. And I'm sure you must have heard of One Health before. And if you haven't, I'm sure you have with this lecture series. And I am a huge proponent of One Health and have really supported and pushed One Health for a long time. It really has the opportunity to be the ultimate collaboration with broad benefits, not just to humans, but to animals and the environment. And it's a great reminder that the all in this together kind of thing is a good way to avoid the us versus them approach of labeling wildlife as villains and sources of infections that are just waiting to jump over to humans. But we need to make sure that we keep those types of messages in mind and make sure that One Health doesn't come across just as we need to address disease in animals to protect humans. And sometimes that's the way it can come across. And an example that I can think of is when some academics were trying to get grants to make the argument, they were making the argument about the zoonotic risk of CWD. And because of that, we needed new diagnostic tests because all cervids should be tested before they were consumed. And they did this without realizing the sheer number of harvested deer and elk and the ability logistically, let alone financially, to test every cervid before it's consumed, let alone the need in areas where CWD is not endemic, let alone that some people care and some people really don't care and will consume a CWD positive carcass, even if it tests positive. And this is a situation when in academics, we need to be sure we understand the larger context and the potential for unintended consequences of our actions and our words that could really confuse the public or impair the ability of a management agency to do their job well. Another example, and with this agency and academic interaction, is one that I'm working in. And in 2017, Washington State University was legislatively mandated as the research lead on this emerging hoof disease in elk in Washington State. And it was a bit of an odd situation. It might not be the only time legislation has directed a university to take on what would generally be thought of as the role of a state wildlife management agency, but it's the only one I know of. And coming from a background in management, it made me somewhat uncomfortable for legislation to be making decisions like this. But then again, legislation had made that decision, so I saw it as an opportunity. And an opportunity to come in and be able to provide information to managers to help address this disease. And while I'm likely not addressing things the exact same way that the State Department of Fish and Wildlife would, I'm doing my best to conduct the research and outreach, and my position is 75% research and 25% outreach that will benefit managers and the resource. But with that said, one thing I think it's really important while collaborating with these management agencies is still also retaining a neutral position. That is, not being a researcher for the agency, but instead as an independent researcher conducting research to inform management decisions. And that is an important distinction for creating and maintaining trust with stakeholders, which in my case, or probably in many situations, is really needed for people to be open to scientifically supported information and then the associated management action. And while it may be tough for an agency if research finds contrary to their preferred management action, it's good to know, and particularly if the managers are looped in prior to the release of the findings more broadly. But if academic research supports their action, it can really help to have a third party support and justify their management. And that is definitely, with some of the things we're dealing with now, I think we're seeing both of those situations with hoof disease and elk. But where it is, I think the best example is we are collecting supporting information that this is an infectious disease process and is has a bacterial etiology, and that cause of hoof disease is very controversial with our stakeholders. So having this third neutral party of a university and a trusted university come in and provide this information, I think can really help the management agency in this case where we found that their hypotheses are appearing to be correct, that this is an infectious disease process versus a toxicity issue. So again, kind of looking overall at the lessons learned, just a reminder that academia is responsible for educating the next generation of wildlife managers, and particularly with graduate student programs that are supported by management agencies or give students access to these agencies. I see it as this big win for a broader education and starting out seeing the benefits of that collaboration. So that's really cool. It also helps support managers' needs, but again, maintaining that neutrality and not just being there to back up everything the managers say, but to be this trusted party. When we're doing our research in academia, as much as we can, even if we're doing basic research, seeing the way that eventually it can apply to moving us forward with wildlife health and with management actions. As I mentioned, recognizing the impact of our statements, things that we can say in, say, a grant application to try to inflate the importance of the situation, maybe beyond what the science currently suggests, to try to make it more likely to be funded, but having the unintended consequence of having negative impacts to the value of the wildlife or our ability to conduct wildlife management. The other thing that I see in academia, and I actually felt this, and maybe it was just me, but the importance of valuing everyone's education. And sometimes we think of academia, those are the super smart people and they know how to do all this bench research and work at the molecular level on all this stuff. And that is really important knowledge, but it's also really important to have a knowledge of the host species and the populations and disease ecology and the functioning of the ecosystem. And not one person can know all of that. And none of those links is more important than the other in helping us address wildlife disease issues. And so everyone's knowledge is important. And we can really benefit each other if we can kind of see where each other is coming from and how our contributions may help support the other. And I think there's realistic ways to do this. So let's move on to the final category, and that's engaging with stakeholders. And I've been using that term stakeholders, and it just means the individuals and groups who may be affected by or can affect wildlife management decisions and programs. And it's not just about our traditional clients, if you will, we think of in wildlife or with state wildlife management agencies, that is hunters. But remember that we need to think much more broadly. And so for particularly you students, if you got into wildlife because you like animals more than you like people, and somebody hasn't already burst your bubble, I guess that's what I'm here to do today. And as Leopold stated, the challenge of wildlife management is more about managing people than wildlife. And I must admit, I am one of those people that did get into wildlife because I liked animals probably more than people. But I have to say that I've really come to value and find so much benefit in interactions with stakeholders. It's really fulfilling to work with stakeholders. I think if you go into it with a positive mindset. Of course, when I started, and as a veterinarian, I think of disease and the epidemic triad, we call this. And we spend years studying the technical aspects of the pathogen and the host and the environment, and how they interact to result in a disease. But what we often don't think about is the fact that disease happens in a social context. And so why is that social context so important when we're talking about wildlife diseases? Well, that's because in the United States, wildlife is a public trust resource, and it's managed by the state and federal government for current and future generations. So wildlife is a valued resource. And if we think of an analogy to another valued resource like your money, we can think of it, the trust is the money or the wildlife resource. And that's what we hold in trust. The trustee could be the banker who invests your money, or the government, which is delegated down to the manager, who manages the assets that are in the trust, not for their own benefit, but on behalf of the beneficiaries. And the beneficiaries are the people or organizations who will ultimately receive the trust assets. So with wildlife, we can think about that as the future generations. And so for wildlife resources, I think Decker stated these principles really nicely, in that wildlife resources are an endowment of natural wealth to be stewarded as an intergenerational inheritance. All beneficiaries benefit from conservation, and interest of all should receive fair consideration. So not just our typical constituencies. And then that management decisions should avoid foreclosing options for future citizens to benefit from the resource. So given these principles, it's really critical that we maintain the value of the trust resource to pass on. And the health of the trust resource, the health of wildlife, is among its highest values. So wildlife health is essential to public trust administration. And to maintain the value of wildlife, they need to maintain their inherent value. Their value as components of functional ecosystems, their value to humans. And also not to have a negative impact on human or animal health that may devalue wildlife. And so you'll notice that our focus isn't just on the prevalence of disease, although sometimes that is what it really seems we focus on, and particularly as a veterinarian, that's what I can get fixated on, is the infectious agent and the epidemiology and the transmission and surveillance methods and diagnostics and disease ecology. But we have to think about why we are managing wildlife diseases. And we find that it's not just about managing the prevalence of a disease, but it's really about managing concerns about the disease, as this model shows. And those concerns can be direct impacts of the disease. So for example, killing wild animals, it's killing wild animals, or it's exposing livestock or humans to disease. They can also be collateral impacts, like lost hunting or viewing opportunities, or the economic impact to a livestock producer of having a reservoir of disease in a wildlife species. And so it's important to note that those collateral impacts are caused not by just the disease, although the disease does cause those impacts. Also, potentially our management actions that we put in place to manage the prevalence of the disease, or concerns about the impacts of the disease, they can create other different concerns. So say we cull wildlife, and that may help decrease the prevalence, but it may increase the overall concern about the disease, because now people are concerned both about the disease and about the culling actions. So we have to keep those kinds of things in mind. And that's where a model like this can help us sort through the direct as well as unintended or collateral impacts of our management actions. And also, where do we get the information to put into a model like that? Or how do we know what stakeholders' concerns are? I think it's easy for us to assume that stakeholders' concerns are the same as our concerns, but that may or may not be the case. And so we need to reach out to the stakeholders and whether that be informally talking to people or through qualitative methods like focus groups or quantitative methods like survey, or techniques beyond that engage stakeholders even more to learn about people's perspectives and values and what they think about the disease and what should be done to manage it. And this is that range of stakeholder engagement. Many agencies are still in that informed stage to the far left there, where they think they can just provide more information. And with more information, the public will, number one, read it or listen to it. Number two, understand it and agree with it. And then support the action. And this gets down to just thinking that we can just educate the public. And if they were just educated, they'd come to the same conclusions that we are at. But there's a couple of issues with that. First, assuming that the case really is that the public does just need to be educated, how do we know that our education effort is having the desired effect? We really need to evaluate these efforts, whether it's a brochure or a public meeting. We very often forget to take the step to find out if people are taking away the message that we intended for them to take away, or if they took away something else because of the way we were communicating. And then second, in reality, it is much more complicated than just educating the public. This far to the left side of the figure here, information approach. More contemporary wildlife management suggests a range of stakeholder engagement strategies, and this increasing stakeholder involvement seen as ways to manage public trust resources. Now, this could be the topic of an entire presentation itself, but I'm just going to summarize it by saying and really encouraging you to learn more about human dimensions and apply those techniques. That is a huge part of our lessons learned in this section. And there's one, if you're only going to look at one source, particularly if you're in the wildlife health area, I'd encourage you to go to the USGS Field Manual of Wildlife Diseases. It's available online, and there is the web address. It's on USGS's website. It's free. If you just Google USGS Field Manual of Wildlife Diseases and then look through the chapter to find the chapter on human dimension considerations in wildlife disease management. This is a really very applied chapter aimed at the wildlife manager. It's based in scholarship, but you don't feel that when you're reading it. It's like getting some good advice. And I think it's a great reference for you to remember. Just a couple of my favorite lessons, though, rather than speaking so broadly, is to work with stakeholders to develop trust. And it sounds really silly, but I'm going to say start by answering your phone. You would not believe how often when I answer my phone, stakeholders thank me and say, wow, you're the first person who answered the phone and took a few minutes to talk with me. And it goes so far in building that trust and those relationships where people will then support you and acknowledge and trust that you're being honest with them and transparent with them. If you can listen to and respect their views. Another piece is what I talked a little bit about, is remembering that more information may not be what's needed. Sometimes we say, oh, we just need to put out a brochure, or we just need to do a presentation, and then everyone will understand. But we can't change values that quickly. It takes more than that. And so we really have to think through this and be very strategic, just like we are with other technical aspects of our management, and construct consistent messages and have those delivered by trusted sources. And That trusted source may be different in different situations and may change over time. I always thought of public health as being very much a trusted source of information. But recently, in the world we live in now, they're being much more questioned. Hopefully, over time, their role as a trusted source will increase. And I think when we're thinking about One Health type issues, veterinarians, wildlife veterinarians, can be a really good liaison and source of information and kind of bridge between the health aspects and the wildlife aspects. So just I guess kind of a blatant plug for my own profession as well. So let's go back to that first example and being put on the spot and answering that really hard question. I wanted to take it into a little bit more depth than just my colleague's answer. And as I was putting together this presentation, I just happened upon this article in Scientific American, where I think Karen Kirk did just a beautiful job of summarizing. And it starts off just by listening to people. And then actually say back what you agree on. And if you have supporting data about that, bring it up. Yeah, you're right. Male mule deer are more likely to have chronic wasting disease than females. You're right, it does impact those males a lot. And then focus on the solutions. If there's areas that you're finding common ground, follow those. Because when you start building that common ground, then you can avoid just being into a roadblock right up front. But then maybe later on, then you can start getting into those areas later after you establish your common ground, your common goal, and state that in a way that appeals to both of you. And really recognize that you're not going to change somebody's mind and they're not going to change your mind in one conversation, but through these ways of longer term involvement, we have the ability for persuasion over the long term, whether it be the stakeholders helping us understand their perspectives and us helping the stakeholders to understand ours. And in the end, the effective wildlife manager and the person who I'm looking to hire when I worked for a state or federal agency was somebody who had technical skills. Not just technical skills though. They really needed to have these soft skills and understand and appreciate and be efficient at the skills of communication and collaboration, or what you might call teamwork, and have this growth mindset and be able to recognize that we really need all of these skills to promote wildlife health. So just a few acknowledgements of some of my mentors who have really had a great influence on me, and I really appreciate what I've learned from them. And then I also just have to mention that I just shamelessly lifted some of the photographs that I used today from the internet. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and see if we have a few minutes for questions.
We sure do. Yeah, this is Jennifer speaking, and you are, if anybody wants to go ahead and put their questions in the chat, we do have a couple already. And so, and Dr. Wild, it's up to you how long you would like to stick around. We are, it's 4 to 5, or literally 4 to 5 o'clock right now on our side. So 4 to the hour. So it's up to you. But in the meantime, Shelley, did you want to read the questions, or how would you like to move forward?
Well, the first one is from Scott, so he might want to deliver his question himself.
Sure, I'd be glad to. You know, there was a time when you were working the Park Service at Rocky Mountain National Park. I was involved with Kurt Ricotta in an elk project involving with CWD. And I said the thing that I most recall was the mountain of paperwork that we had to move along with Park Service personnel to be able to do the work. And now that you're removed from the Park Service, I was just curious if you can comment on your feelings regarding the necessity of such a paper trail for a project.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I've been trying to obtain elk for captive work here in Pullman, and working with several federal agencies, and being on the other side of that, and like having to take a machete to red tape. You know, it can be really challenging. It kind of reminds me of working with the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee too.
Mm-hmm.
It takes so much time and so much effort, but in the end, it's there for a reason. And the reason is to protect the resource and to protect the mission and mandate of those agencies. And while it's really easy to get frustrated and start cussing them, and I have to admit, I might have done that myself the last couple of weeks, realize why it's there is that those trust managers are taking care of those resources for the American public. And they've got that bureaucracy in place to make sure that we can protect it. And so I don't know, maybe I've just been a long-term government employee who's had submission beat into me, but I think it's a good thing to try to appreciate the importance of that and follow it, and just kind of try to roll with it and recognize it's something that you need to do.
I'm glad you answered the question that way. You did a great job on it.
Okay, let's see what the next one is.
I think the next one is from me. I'd be happy to.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Read my own question. So I'm actually curious about, because when you were talking about, One Health, so I'm not reading my question verbatim here, but when you were talking about One Health, you kind of talked about how it's not, we shouldn't just be focusing just on animal health in particular, and just because it could potentially affect us. And this got me thinking, like, do you have any ideas about kind of changing the public's attitude towards preserving wildlife health and environmental health for its own sake, as opposed to just thinking about it from an anthropogenic point of view all the time? Like, do you have any thoughts about how to kind of push encourage attitude shifts towards, wildlife health and environmental health are important for their own sake?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's a challenging one. I happen to think that One Health is our way to do that. And while today I mainly talked about kind of an unintended consequence of some of our communications on One Health, I think with good communication, we can help people understand the benefits to all. Now, I have to admit, there's a lot of times I'll go to a meeting and people, I might say particularly in the human medical profession, completely view One Health in a very different way than I do. Whereas I see it as making all environmental aspects healthy and animals healthy and humans healthy is a way to keep us all healthy. They see that in some cases as all those things need to be healthy so they can keep humans healthy. And if it ends up with the same result, I guess I'm okay with it. But oftentimes I think we just need to continue to talk to people and share our views and hear theirs. And oftentimes when I talk to people about One Health, it never even occurred to them. We're so anthropocentric. All we can think about is our own well-being. But sometimes when you share that idea, you'll see the light bulb go on and, oh yeah, oh, that would be good. I do care about wildlife and I would like to see them healthy. I don't want to see wildlife sick. So again, finding that common goal. And I think using One Health is a really good model to do that.
Excellent. Our next question comes from Anna, and she asked, what courses do you recommend for graduate students looking to develop those soft skills? Or I guess experiences in courses, maybe.
Wow, Anna, stumped me. That is a great question. And I don't know, maybe you guys know better. I'm in academia now, but I don't teach. And so I don't even know what would be available at WSU. I don't even think we have a course like this. In vet school, we do. It's a risk communication course that's taught in the vet school. But so I'm going to let Shelley and Scott address that in some way, but I'm going to just say first, what I did primarily was I found really good mentors. I found people that I respected, and I liked the way that they responded and the way people responded to them. And then I tried to emulate that behavior. And I was really fortunate too to work with Dr. Dan Decker at Cornell University, who I just think is, I mean, he's more or less the father of human dimensions and work a lot. And so I read a lot of Dan's writings and have collaborated in publications with Dan. And so there's a number of publications out there you can read. But wow, great question. And formally, I don't know. I'll see if you guys have any follow-up on that.
Well, I know that Katie Sartini, one of our faculty members, is on the line here, and she teaches a course in human dimensions in wildlife. It's a 400 level course. So all of our seniors in wildlife have to go through it. And I know it's a very good course and really helps them down that road. We do encourage students to take courses in interpersonal communication, group dynamics. Let's see, I've seen some others on group communication and scientific writing. So there's oral as well as written communication. There's a long list of courses relative to communication, and but that isn't just the end of the soft skills. It'd be the sociological courses, psychological courses, if you really want to dig into these areas deeply. And now we're talking about another degree in totally another field. But at least that gets a start.
Scott, you out of the center, you guys have been offering those leadership and organizational workshops for our students that are in the Wildlife Society. I think that those are a really good examples of, Margaret had written that you need to have collaborative experience. So, let's say somebody were to call you or me or Katie Sartini, who's participating in the chat, and say, all right, well, give me an example of how your students had to collaborate, to solve a problem. And, I would always go to our Tree Haven experience. Our undergrads have to work as a team for 6 weeks, usually teams of 4 students, for 6 weeks to accomplish a goal. Any class projects that I know you undergrads look so excited about having to work in teams. But that's an example. What Dr. Wild said is we get those questions when they ask, give me an example of how they had to work as part of a team to solve a problem. And that collaborative skill that she mentioned, I think, is critical for that. No. Katie wrote that Decker wrote the textbook for our human dimensions class, Margaret. So, very good. And workshops and conferences can be really helpful. And she said, I like Margaret's advice about emulating behavior you appreciate to see in your colleagues. And yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. A next question.
Actually, Shelley, can I make a comment
Yeah.
quick? Well, I want to thank you for, first of all, plugging the center's leadership opportunities. But I was going to say things like, dynamic leadership workshops, any type of leadership workshops, I think are good there, especially, but don't think of leadership as in, it's me having an authority and leading a group. It's a different kind of, like Kurt Miney was talking about earlier this week. It's kind of how do we collaborate? How do we make this work? And I think that, I might be kind of stepping outside bounds here, but it's not something you can necessarily teach in school, but just like exposing yourself to deliberately exposing yourself to other viewpoints and kind of looking at those viewpoints and thinking about, what do you think about them? I think helps you kind of just develop those soft skills just in terms of exposing yourself to it. So, but just a thought.
No, excellent point. Excellent point. I think you have to work sometimes to be open-minded. You really do. Sean asked, how did you go about getting involved in the National Park Service? This is a really good question because they didn't have a veterinarian before Margaret. Does the USGS usually have positions for wildlife veterinarians to work on projects like you mentioned today?
Sometimes it's a matter of being in the right place at the right time. But my favorite quote is, "Fortune favors the prepared mind." And that is to have your goal and hope and that things can work out. And I was a veterinarian in a state wildlife management agency, and then the position with the National Park Service opened up. It was a newly created position with a bunch of new funding that the National Park Service got. And I was fortunate enough to see that and say, wow, philosophically that fits with me really nicely, and to be successful in going after that. And then being fortunate enough to get additional funding to where now, when I left the Park Service, there were 5 veterinarians. And so be able to build this cadre, because it's really hard to be the only one. And so we served parks throughout the national park system. USGS has some veterinarians, primarily at the National Wildlife Health Center in Madison. And a lot of the work they do is in pathology and disease investigation and research. And so there's a good source for you not too far from home. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service has they have 2 positions in terrestrial mammal wildlife health and bird wildlife health, is in addition to some fish positions, as well as many of the state wildlife agencies. And when I came in, there was just a handful of people doing wildlife veterinary work with free-ranging species with state and federal agencies. But it's something that's really grown now, and it is much more of a possibility of getting a job. So yeah, I guess I'd just say, it takes a lot of education, a lot of training, and it's incredibly rewarding as well. And there's opportunities, not that you're, guaranteed a position, but there are many more opportunities now than there used to be.
Yeah, Jonathan Sleeman was on the call earlier, was on the Zoom listening in, and we do have a couple of wildlife vets, I think, state wildlife vets on the call now. Sean wrote, "Thank you, Dr. Wild. I'm a guest to today's talk from Michigan State. Yay, go Spartans. I grew up right down the road, but I hope to follow a similar path as you. Go White." Thank you. So very good. Cool to have Sean on the call. Rose asked, "It's a little surprising to me that National Park Service did not know that rabies is a technically invasive disease, considering they are a large scientific-based organization. Are there methods in place to prevent this kind of misinformation now, or at least get the right information out?"
Yeah, I should say that was 20 years ago. And to me, that kind of seems like yesterday. It was a long time ago. But I think when you're missing an area of technical expertise, you can just have a blind spot. And at the time, the National Park Service didn't have a veterinarian. And so, they just knew the disease had been there for a long time and just made the assumption that it was native. And quite honestly, that was one of my most difficult questions I got when I worked for the Park Service. Parks would always call and say, "So I've got such and such disease in the park. Is it native or exotic?" Oh gosh, I don't know. And if the disease is really native, think of all the anthropogenic change that we have to the host and the environment, and is it really natural? But anyway, so yes, now I would say, I feel I left the National Park Service as being an absolute leader in wildlife health because of the way we provided service, and they continue to provide service to the parks with professional wildlife veterinarians providing that support. And so I think they're in a really way better place than they were 20 years ago.
Excellent. Do we have any more questions for Dr. Wild? Anything else come up? Let's see if I'm. I've been thinking about the triad. I've got to give a lecture or record my lecture on disease management this like tomorrow. And I was thinking about the triad in relation to COVID-19, you know. So many people are now just saying, you know, to not wear masks or whatever. And I'm thinking, okay, well, you can handle diseases from the host, right? You can handle diseases from, or try to manage them from the agent, or you can try to manage the environment, right? Those are your choices, right? And so I was thinking about this as I'm not sleeping last night about other things. But one of the things was like, well, could we even consider managing the agent or the environment? Right? I mean, do we only have the host, which is humans? I mean, is that our only choice in relation to COVID? I don't know. I mean, I'm throwing this out there for Kimberly and Colin and Scott and all the other veterinarians and other wildlife and human health, you know, people on the call. Scott Wright said, glad you were able to work in those special places. Yay. That rascal's on here. And then Katie Sartini, thanks so much for sharing your time with us. She does a lot of human dimensions work. So,
and Shelley, just to answer your question about, you know, the host pathogen or environment, I guess also, you know, that social context, it's all in the social context. And if we can effectively communicate and identify ways to have that consistent messaging, I think that's where that social context can really help us overcome what the host pathogen and environment can't do alone.
That is an excellent thing for me to include in my lecture. I will be preparing very soon. So thank you for that. Thank you so much.
There's one final question here from Rose Arnold about I think your CWD paper. Is there evidence that wolves will not also spread the prion when they consume positive D.V.M?
Yep, that's probably the most commonly asked question. And interestingly, so there's a couple ways you can look at it. One is, could canids become infected with the prion disease? And interestingly, canids, there's no natural prion disease in canids. There's prion disease in primates and cervids and mustelids and a whole bunch of species, but not in canids. There's also in felids, but not in canids. So what's really cool is there's something different about the prion gene, probably, that there's no natural prion disease in canids. The second part is, people always say, well, could they eat an infected animal and then run away and then poop, and then they poop the prion? And that has been shown, I think, in corvids and maybe coyotes or some other mesocarnivore. But my argument would be that the prion is not titanium. It is resistant to degradation, but even going through the digestive tract can reduce by logs the amount of infectivity, and it can also dilute the infectivity. And I would argue that the amount of time that it takes between the time a wolf or coyote eats infectious material and poops it out is probably about a day. And the length that they're going to travel in a day is probably not more than those deer elk would have traveled anyway. And that it will be diluted out more. And we don't know what the infectious dose for prion disease is. And so perhaps the solution to pollution is dilution. I don't know, maybe it makes it worse. But at least you don't have that hot spot concentrated of a carcass anymore. And this is totally my own speculation, but I think it is based in scientific knowledge.
Excellent. I thought, didn't they do some of that out in Wyoming years ago, where they fed carcasses to coyotes and then looked at the end mountain lions, if I remember right. I don't, this is going back a while, you know, back to 1996 when we were in Alaska, sometime around there. But if I remember right, they did not find the prion went up the food chain.
Right, the Colorado Division of Wildlife, Mike Miller and Lisa Wolf were doing that work and feeding prion infected cervids to captive mountain lions. It was a very small sample size and the mountain lions were related. So, but nothing as far as transmission was detected, at least that I've seen in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
But bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease, did transfer from cattle to big cats in zoos. So there is a feline spongiform encephalopathy, but no canine spongiform encephalopathy.
Very good. We're learning about human dimensions and all sorts of things tonight. That's just so great. And I can't thank you enough again, Margaret, for being willing to be here. The level of our expertise on this seminar series is really just, you know, it's fabulous, and it's because you were here, you know, partly because you're here. So thank you so much. Scott or Jennifer, do you have anything else?
I just think it's great to see how well our audience is holding. We still have 6 pages of participants here. They don't want to go, even though it's dinner time and everybody needs to go. Yep. But and it was the same way with our last seminar series. So this is outstanding. Thanks, Margaret, for the time you spent with us and enlightening us in this you know, kind of human dimensions side of wildlife disease management.